Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barreto. I am an assistant professor of law and technology at the Faculty of Law, Common Law section, and the director of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa. Et je suis très heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour ce nouvel événement du Centre de recherche en droit, technologie et société de l'Université d'Ottawa. Et aujourd'hui, nous accueillons Jean-Noé Landry pour une conférence sur les données ouvertes et les villes intelligentes, ainsi que la professeure Teresa Scaza, qui est professeure ici à la faculté de droit de l'Université d'Ottawa. So that first event, so it's one of the CLTS speaker series, but it's also the first event as part of one of our new projects on smart cities, a Law Foundation of Ontario Fellowship on smart cities. So we applied a few months ago, and Jean-Noé was awarded the fellowship by the Law Foundation. So to work on those issues, on agencies in smart cities, citizen engagement, open data. So it will give, it's the first talk, but not the last one at Ottawa. This year we're going to organize some workshops, some events with community organization over the years. So check our website to be to get our last news. And so he's not kind of an academic as a fellow at CLTS, but Jean-Noé is also the executive director of Open North, Nord Ouvert en français, Canadian NGO based in Montreal, but working all over the place in Canada and even outside Canada, more and more. Mm-hmm. And this is what I'm gonna present to you today. And so it will talk for about 45 minutes, mm-hmm. and then a Q&A session will follow, and that session will be moderated by Professor Scaza, who is a professor at the Faculty of Law, Common Law section, and the Canada Research Chair in Information Law and Policy at the Centre. So without further ado, we'll hand it over to Jean-Noé. Thank you very much.
Great. Merci beaucoup, Florian. Thank you very much. It's nice to have this camera right in my face. It's amazing. So, first talk of the fellowship, so it's really nice to be here. We are based in Montreal, but we do work, like Florian said, across the country, and I'll tell you more about how we came about to establish ourselves as a leader in Canada and internationally on what we're calling open smart cities. And today I want to basically take you through a description of Open North and how our mission has shifted. We've been doing and working on open data and open government for the past 10 years or so. And I think there's some interesting kind of lessons to learn about how our mission has shifted and how our approach and methodology has changed as we've come to focus on open smart cities. I want to name some of the questions that are informing my fellowship at Ottawa U. I'm not going to dive too deeply on each of those questions, but it's also a reminder to myself of why I'm here and kind of the research agenda that I've set out for myself over the next year. And then the core of the presentation and the talk that I want to give is basically kind of report back on a series of events that took place recently in Argentina. So the International Open Data Conference, it's the main international conference for the open data movement. I think it's the fourth or the fifth event of that kind that took place. And this is really kind of where the open data community internationally convenes for a week. It's kind of like a bit of a festival, type of where you have all these pre-events leading up to the main event, not necessarily different stages like a music kind of festival, but you still have a very broad diversity of stakeholders that are coming together to discuss the issues of the day. And so I'm going to give you an insight over kind of the big trends that we're seeing internationally on open data, and then kind of bring that back to cities themselves. We co-organized the Open Cities Summit, which was the second event of its kind globally. I want to draw some lessons from that, and then have a discussion about what this all means for the Canadian context. Okay, and I've got some questions to inform our discussion around that. So let's start with Open North. So Open North, founded in 2011, primarily as a civic tech organization, but then also from an advocacy mission perspective, okay? And so when you look back at the kind of evolution and kind of progress of the open data and open government community internationally and also in Canada, it makes sense that some of the first organizations needed to demonstrate what is the actual tangible benefits or impact of releasing more government data in a machine-readable open data format. What can we do with that data, right? We had to demonstrate what is the return on investment for governments that were expecting to, adopt an open data policy, establish a website, put data out, then what, right? And so we needed to build tools, we needed to build some of the first apps, prototypes, proofs of concepts technologically to be able to demonstrate what is the value of increased transparency, increased accountability, going from principles to like tangible outcomes and outputs from a technological perspective. So that was kind of the early days of the of Open North. And we've kind of shifted over time. And I just want to name some of those shifts, and we'll come back to that a bit later in the presentation. So the first thing is that we started, and this makes a lot of sense, we started mainly in Montreal, okay? So at the very kind of city, even borough level, where citizens and elected officials had a closer interaction and where the data was actually closest to the needs and the type of experiences that residents would have with their local communities. Think of potholes, think of budget, transparency, mobility type of issues. These are the things that we all experience on a daily basis, right? Like in cities and in communities, and there's data connected to that. So it made sense that from a nonprofit perspective or from an advocacy role, then we wanted to make sure that the data that's closest to the needs of residents would become accessible. So cities was our primary kind of level that we targeted from our mission perspective. We then scaled quickly internationally because we realized that we weren't alone advocating for increased transparency and accessibility to data. And so we then kind of reached out and kind of connected with all these different communities internationally that were focused on, open contracting, beneficial ownership, extractive sectors, and you just kind of start to realize that if you want to name a theme, if you want to name kind of an issue area that people care about, there's probably an open data network that's related to making more data accessible on that specific theme. So it's kind of encouraging from a movement building perspective that you realize, okay, there's like people out there that also care about the things that we're focused on at a very local or national level. So we went from a local to global, and now we're kind of coming back to the local mindset and approach. Like I said, we focused primarily early on from a civic tech perspective in building technology, and we helped build some of the first open data portals in Canada. We don't do that now as much, primarily because we're much more focused on the actual data itself. And so developing standards for data from an interoperability perspective. So when you're formatting data, you want to make sure, in some cases, from an open data advocacy perspective, that you're adopting the same standards of data structures and formats so that different sources of similar data are abiding by those same protocols and standards as well. So we've developed an expertise around data interoperability as it relates to different cities, but also at different levels of government, from an interjurisdictional perspective, but then also from a kind of a more lateral kind of city-to-city network building perspective. So that's another shift. The third shift was that at first, and I'm sure you've heard of these types of events like hackathons or ideathons or co-optathons, or there's like, name it, there's like a lot of different kind of rebranding that's been done around the notion of hacking or hackathons. So we helped organize some of the first ones in Montreal and in Canada. The first one that we did was more kind of general. It's like, let's just see what we can do with the data that's available. But the real issue and the real kind of focus that we wanted to bring in our advocacy was around fighting corruption. right? But from an advocacy perspective, if you want to gain traction politically or administratively with decision makers within the public administration, you're definitely not going to start talking about anti-corruption and how you want to, open up government and kind of have access to those databases off the bat. Although you know that that's the goal that actually drives you and kind of mobilizes your efforts. And so we shifted away from the hackathon model, and we're much more interested now in kind of institutionalizing governance mechanisms to be able to engage with citizens and with residents and nonprofits in a much more kind of permanent way, right? So recognizing the limitations of hosting these one-off events. You show up, you drink a lot of coffee, have pizza, you do what you can in 2 days, and then what happens next, right? So we're much more interested in developing a sustained dialogue with a much broader range of stakeholders. And so now, we're more into that kind of shared governance component. At Open North now, we've also developed a research unit on applied research, actually. And so we were being asked to document our expertise. We had access to a lot of different types of stakeholders, and so we decided, well, let's develop our own research agenda and our own kind of research team so that we're able to not only benefit from our networks, but then connect with academics, other types of stakeholders that don't necessarily have access to the same people as we do. So our applied research lens has kind of standardized our approach to the knowledge that we want to curate. And then lastly, but not least, we have now come to develop more of an intermediary role. And this is actually something that we're seeing a lot with different types of organizations like ours, which means that we kind of situate ourselves as bridge builders between different types of stakeholders within an ecosystem. Okay, and so instead of just kind of chasing contracts or projects or programs or building kind of one-off relationships, we're interested in kind of convening and being able to kind of situate ourselves like as a hub, as like where different spokes are able to kind of connect with one another within a city context. And there's value added there, but it also means that our mission and our capacities and capabilities have had to evolve also over time. We're now brokering the deals. We're now kind of mediating between different types of stakeholders. That's a completely different type of world and type of role that we had initially when we were doing more event organizing and advocacy. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of paint kind of how Open North has shifted. One key document that I won't reference too much during the presentation, but just as a note to yourselves, and if you want to kind of pursue with interest, what we do is our Open Smart Cities Guide, okay, which is a research that we did with CIPIC. David Fewer is here, and this was an idea that we had where we were looking at smart cities, and like, well, how do we reconcile the openness movement and the openness principles with what's going on in the smart cities kind of world, whatever that means, right? Because we know that there's so many different types of definitions, and like smart cities is a very, very fluid kind of concept, and so is open data or openness. And so the big challenge that we face is how do we reconcile that and create a definition and a guide on open smart cities from an ethical standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from an advocacy standpoint, from a data management standpoint. So the Open Smart Cities Guide is the first of its kind, and we've actually developed the first definition of what it is to have an open smart city. So I invite you to check that out. And the last piece before going more kind of the international level is that we now have opportunities that we were dreaming of, actually, maybe 10 years ago. Okay, and the main one that we have in terms of scaling our expertise and really connecting cities with one another is through the Smart Cities Challenge, okay, in Canada. So you might have heard of the Smart Cities Challenge. It's a 9 or 10 year program. Right now we're in the second stage where we have 20 finalists that have been selected by a jury nationally and also internationally to compete with one another to win a prize on smart cities. So this is a really, really interesting opportunity because when you look at how other countries have mobilized and injected investments into the smart city space, usually it's more from a strictly kind of technological kind of basis. Let's see who creates the more advanced, kind of more efficient city. Canada did it a little bit differently. And part of the reason why I did it differently is because of the advocacy that Open North and a number of different stakeholders, including CIPIC actually, and the Open Smart Cities Guide, which we know has had an impact in influencing the foundational elements or principles of the challenge itself. So that's why there's an openness element there. It's because of the work that we've done to be able to do that. So that kind of work, sometimes it pays off, okay? So from a systems change lens, it's very important because now we're now getting into the realm of open smart cities, right? Officially, because cities, as they compete, they need to abide by a certain set of principles, and openness is one of them. There was a call for proposals for a large capacity building program that the government, Infrastructure Canada, wanted to support. And we learned the good news a couple of weeks ago where we were given that mandate to build an advisory team together to offer our services in building that team to support capacity building of cities, smart cities, and now we're rebranding it as Open Smart Cities in Canada right now. So a lot of the work that we've been doing up until now, we now have the opportunity to develop our own capacity internally within Open North, but then also in collaboration with a number of different advisors across the country to help scale these best practices and really, truly, and hopefully build a stronger peer-to-peer knowledge network between cities, large and small, rural, indigenous communities across the country. Okay, so this is kind of a unique opportunity that deserves to be named because it's a different model than what we've seen from traditional kind of smart city challenges elsewhere in the world. So in terms of my own kind of research questions, okay, so what I'm interested in with this fellowship, which you know, you won't be surprised by some of the questions that I'll name here. It's like, how can citizens, you know, are citizens commodified in a smart city? What other public goods get commodified in the smart city? And are there trade-offs such as individual privacy and power relations? How is political participation framed in smart cities? What changes occur as a result of the introduction of various networked and urban smart technologies, et cetera, okay? So we're really now at the kind of the ethical kind of layer of understanding how is citizenship, how is the sense of kind of belonging in a community being shifted? How are democratic space being shifted through smart city systems, okay? And so that's kind of the core question that's going to kind of inform my thinking and research over the next year. All right, so now I want to take us to kind of more the global kind of level, bring it to cities, and then take some questions. For the global, sometimes it's not easy to know where to begin, right? Because you're dealing with a movement, it's quite fluid. If you're familiar with like movement building kind of theory, by definition, you want to have that agility to be able to accommodate and to welcome in an inclusive, empowering, kind of respectful way where the energy is around different types of topics. So it's been very kind of challenging to be able to keep track of the open data movement internationally. And because this year marked the 10th year, arguably, of the open data community, there was an initiative that for which we received funding from the Open Data for Development Network, which is an IDRC, or the International Development Research Center program, to be able to document what is the state of open data in the world. And so I want to share with you some of the findings from that. It's all available online, okay? So let's get into it. So I'm going to take us through kind of the state of open data, 10 years of open data. And actually, I should probably elaborate a little bit why 10 years. Like, what was the actual marking point that defined the 10-year mark? Does anybody know that? Anybody have an idea why it's 10 years? No. So let me tell you. So 10 years ago, there was a group of kind of civic technologists that got together in California, actually, and they came up with 12 principles originally that defined open data. Okay, the 12 principles then got narrowed down to 10, and now we're down to 6 through the International Open Data Charter. But those original principles is kind of seen as the beginning of the open data community. However, there was open data before that we called it open data. And that's really, really important to note, is that it became a bit of a kind of a trendy topic, right, in international kind of development circles and technology and urbanism and whatnot. But obviously we've been using data to inform decision making, to develop policies, for many, many, many years. And there are several academics in Canada that that could also trace it back to some of the early research consortiums from the scientific community in the Arctic, for example, that needed to share data in an open, machine-readable way, and so they created some of the first open data standards. They didn't call it open data, but that's essentially what it was. Okay, so it's good to sometimes have a bit of a reality check when we think, oh, it's 10 years. Well, actually, it's probably more like 30 years, but we're calling it 10 years since the beginning of those principles. So the objectives of the State of Open Data, as the project was called, was to critically review the current state of the open data movement, assessing its progress and effectiveness in addressing challenges related to the social, economic development, and democratization around the world. So open data needs to be contextualized, right? And arguably you could say that it's even more important now given some of the backsliding that we've seen internationally around kind of democracy itself, right? And so there's kind of a sense of urgency now that has come to be able to name, well, what have we actually achieved? What are the challenges that we're facing? And how do we make sure that we don't lose, or actually how do we kind of, invest more in the gains that we've made so that we don't lose that? So by critically assessing capacity of open data activities, we've been able to address challenges across different sectors, regions, and stakeholder communities. I'm going to talk about some of that. The project itself functions as an open resource for the global open data community, and hopefully serves for future research as well. And ideally, to be able to strengthen knowledge sharing across global and regional open data initiative. Because we're operating in an openness space, one of the things that I think has been quite beneficial for us as a relatively small-sized organization is to be able to access and benefit from the work that other organizations like ourselves are doing in other parts of the world. So it's not uncommon for us to have the ability to, network and build from the code that developers in Australia or in Africa or in Asia and around the world, literally. And so that's the kind of the agility that I think the open data kind of movement has, and that's also makes it difficult to document and to be able to keep track of what's going on. So hence the need for a review. So the scope, like I said, on open data communities, overarching issues, global regions, and stakeholder groups. I won't name all of them because there's actually 60 different writers that contributed to it. Teresa Scassa contributed to that body of work, and around 40 different chapters. Okay, and so you can just imagine the complexity of having to curate all of these different writers, ensuring principles of diversity and being able to actually have regional representation, not have the same kind of typical voices, actually take the lead in kind of articulating their articles and chapters. But from a methodology perspective, we saw this as an opportunity actually to work with a broad mix of experienced open data researchers, users, innovators, and activists in order to harness genuine insight into the progress of open data. So that means reviewing past and current activities, assessing the impact on targeted beneficiaries, identify outstanding issues, challenges, and opportunities to be addressed by the broader open data community moving forward, essentially taking stock of where we're at. So big items from kind of takeaways from 10 years of open data. Where are we at? So the open data agenda has made government data more visible. Okay, that as a baseline, I think there's like common agreement that that has been achieved through the open data community's efforts. It has directly and indirectly shaped contemporary debates around data. So arguably you could say that open data has become a bit of an orthodoxy, that it's kind of taken for granted now. If you're going to be a newly elected leader and you're going to campaign on transparency or have some sort of like open government agenda, open data is usually part of your strategy from a digitization perspective, creating online services, and tackling some of the tougher issues that you're seeing kind of locally. There's a data component to that, hence the smart city lens as well. It's led by thousands of people to engage with and build on it and ask critical questions about the data government collects and manages. I think that's a critical point because we're no longer taking for granted that the data that we're seeing is actually objective, right? And that's partly because of the open data community, where we've had to trace back the origins of where the data is coming from. So from in our jargon, kind of the life cycle of a data set, we want to know not just when the data is going to be published, but why the data is being collected in the way that it's being collected, and by whom and for whom, and what decisions have been made at the very, very kind of early stages, right? So that kind of like critical mindset now has kind of led us to be able to kind of share, best practices around those issues. So over the last 10 years, it has surfaced long-standing issues with the quality and representativeness of data inside governments, and revealed the challenges of data-driven policymaking, right? Because to my earlier point, if we're critically assessing the source of the data, we also know that it biases, policies and services that are administered by public administrations themselves, right? So that brings up a whole range of different types of issue, and the open data movement is partly responsible for that. The data space is getting broader, with many more themes in need of attention, new actors, and issues crossing the boundary between open data and wider data policy. And this is a challenge, actually, a bit to the open data community to maintain its relevance as we're broadening the scope of different types of topic. It's no longer just about open data, it's about openness and data and a whole range of different types of issues to which you can apply those two different types of mindsets, right? So that becomes difficult to kind of make sure that we maintain our community together. By contrast, the open space may be at risk of losing energy, and the need to strengthen networks and links between open data and other open development agendas. Think of open AI, right, or algorithmic transparency. Is the open data community the best place to talk about open AI and algorithmic governance? Maybe. The conversation is happening there, but that would be a bit of a, not necessarily a challenge, but a bit of a transition for the open data community to kind of, for all of it to kind of transition towards that, because there's a lot of things that we still need to achieve in the open data space itself. So we need to focus on how to strengthen open advocacy within the wider data landscape. So open data, so that's kind of top line kind of observations. From an open data communities perspective, so communities framing has been challenging. Sectors covered each represent a more complex set of communities and sub-communities. So if you ask somebody in Canada, who says that they're part of the open data community, they probably belong to multiple different communities, of which open data might be something that they feel passionate about, right? But the open data, strictly speaking, the open data community itself in Canada, it's quite small, because not a lot of people would say, I'm part of the open data community. They'll say, well, I'm an urban planner, or I'm a statistician, or I'm a teacher or a healthcare practitioner, and I work with data, and I need to kind of unpack and understand what is the openness or accessibility of making that data public, and all the different types of issues that come into play there. So that's a big challenge for kind of naming communities, right? Because you have to recognize the diversity of a heterogeneous community itself. The level of impact is perhaps tied to relationship with data. So central to the community, or more peripheral to overall sector objectives. So we need to understand, and we're coming to understand kind of more the power dynamics in each of those sectors, right? In the health sector, education sector, science sector. So we need to kind of unpack those power relationships and understand what is the role and what is the actual openness agenda as part of that. There's clearly part of the central discourse is a cluster of communities around anti-corruption, international aid, government finance transparency, and beneficial ownership. So those were some of the primary kind of issues that led the open data, the first kind of open data activists and communities to mobilize. They're still very vibrant, and they're actually kind of expanding. But we need to be mindful that that's not happening at the cost of other communities as well, under that broader umbrella. But those are certainly the ones that are probably better financed, more equipped, deployed around the world as well. So where data is less central, open data networks can still be established, but are on the periphery of broader sector data communities. Think of transport, urban development. We authored a paper a few years ago now on the value added of open data for urban planning or resilience of cities. And that was a really interesting kind of insightful exercise because we realized that obviously urban planners, they know a lot about urban issues, but not necessarily about data itself. They work a lot with information and knowledge, reports, indicators, but they weren't necessarily developing kind of the hard kind of like raw data management or analytical skills. And so that's an exercise in field building, where you're actually kind of redefining a way that different communities of practice are able to, provide their value added in ways that they can collaborate together. There are still underdeveloped agendas that are emerging, and these are, kind of global trends here. A number of fields such as crime and justice and telecoms have nascent communities still exploring how to apply open data ideas, and sometimes it's the emergence of issues that are getting a lot of attention kind of in the media, or that are kind of forcing a certain kind of discourse that then kind of create an appetite for solutions, right? And so what the open data community is good at now more than ever is to be able to kind of resituate a debate less on solutions, but looking at what is the actual source data that we have access to in order to question and ask tough questions around issues that we're seeing in local communities. Crime and justice is a big one, right? If you look at, issues that we're probably all aware of in terms of police brutality or social justice, that kind of agenda. So that's kind of led the open data community to become allies with those types of communities, but it's still an emerging field, partly because the data itself can be quite not necessarily challenging, but there's a lot of privacy issues related to it. I won't go into all of the different sectorial kind of chapters from the state of open data, but I think a key one that I'd like to highlight is the role of civil society internationally, because of how I've kind of presented the shift for Open North at the beginning of the presentation. So civil society plays a vital role in the open data kind of community worldwide, but it takes work to sustain civil society engagement in open data over time. Just the fact that we've had to shift our mission and shift our mandate, that's not easy to do, right? And so a lot of organizations are having to do that. There is quite a lot of diversity within the open data movement. If you compare open data kind of civic initiatives in Asia, for example, to Africa, to Latin America. In Latin America, given the kind of history, the kind of geopolitical history, they have a very, very advanced open data community around legislative transparency and some of the issues that you would expect in terms of fighting corruption and from elected leaders in oppressive states or dictatorial regimes and things like that. When you look at Africa, there's actually an extremely vibrant community right now emerging at the very kind of local level with civic tech kind of meetups that are popping up around the country, developing new apps, new technologies. So really, really kind of at the vanguard of that. And in terms of government efficiency, looking at places like Taiwan, for example, or other places in Asia, we're seeing applications of open data and open government more broadly within public institutions. Taiwan is a really, really interesting case. I can elaborate on that. There is a need, however, for a stronger focus on encouraging and equipping existing national and local civil society organizations to engage with open data agendas. We would know that this has been successful when the majority of the organization events like the one that I attended at the International Open Data Conference were not created as open data organizations, but as established organizations adopting open data strategies and approaches to meet their wider goals. So ideally, I'd like to be able not to talk about open data, but to talk about issues, complex problems, and insert open data as a solution or an approach in resolving these types of issues, right? And so a lot of organizations are starting to kind of get into that direction. There's also a few funders that fund open data specifically, so it's an issue of making yourself relevant as well. So cross-cutting issues, and then I want to get into some possible scenarios for the future and a few observations on cities. So cross-cutting issues. Questioning data creation. Okay, so I mentioned that already before in terms of the subjectivity of data sources. From gender equity and Indigenous data sovereignty, we're seeing calls for a more critical approach to data collection and management. If you're interested in Indigenous data sovereignty, okay, as an issue, in Canada, we published a primer on decolonizing data in Canada that we co-authored with a group of different Indigenous leaders that welcomed us to look critically at the relationship between open data and transparency and accessibility of data and Indigenous data sovereignty. So there's still a lot of work to be done in Canada in reconciling in bringing the reconciliation agenda with the open government agenda. We're pretty far from having accomplished that right now. And yeah, so there's a paper there that I'm happy to share. And on a gender equity perspective, there's a new kind of group internationally that's called Open Heroines. And if you're interested in connecting with them, I know that they're always kind of looking for kind of more people to get involved. And it's quite a lively and actually quite engaged community that really brings women from around the world actually to connect on open data issues. Other cross-cutting issues. Open data has tended to focus on release and use of data rather than creation and management. A focus on the open definition can restrict the space for talking about other meaning of openness, including greater recognition of when closed approaches should be used to protect particular community interests. We're in a gray kind of space between closed and open. There's a lot to unpack in between in terms of sharing data, for whom, with whom, what levels of access from a data protection perspective, privacy rights, and the shared data kind of space is a way to be able to talk about the ideal of getting to an open data state, but in a gradual approach. So you have to be careful, right? You don't want to kind of diminish your expectations of having governments that are open by default, but you also want them to be able to kind of publish with purpose, okay, to use the kind of open data jargon, but in ways that recognizes some of the risks and some of the, the need to have kind of mitigation strategies that are, sometimes and often kind of legitimate around protecting data sources themselves. So the shared data kind of spectrum is actually one that has a lot of different nuances that we're unpacking right now that's enabling us to work and bring more stakeholders together into the open data community and conversation. We may need to support work to identify what open data end-to-end would look like. For example, exploring the kinds of openness that should apply to data collection, engaging in design of data collection, and being accountable throughout the process. That's the life cycle concept that I brought up earlier. I've been talking about this for a few months now, but I've yet to see a government, very concretely, release the risk assessments, okay, that it would normally do when deciding what data to publish, on its open data portal. We only see what we see, right? So if you go on an open data portal for the City of Ottawa, for example, or the Government of Canada, you're seeing a lot of different data sets, but you're not necessarily accessing the internal kind of deliberation process, okay, on what data was made available, what hasn't, and why not. And I see that the risk assessment component as an engagement opportunity to build trust, okay, in government and internal deliberations around data curation and management in government bodies. Work on data infrastructure is gaining traction, but remains largely Anglo-centric, raising the need to build a more global community. There is also a substantial investment gap and a dearth of institutional capacity for scaling open data infrastructure. You can view open data itself as kind of a public good, just like ensuring that data sets remain in kind of that structured, kind of updated way. So data can be understood as infrastructure itself, but then you also, of course, have open data portals and open data websites. And when you locate where those open data portals are, it's concentrated in some parts of the world, and there's actually a case to be made that it should be broadened in different places as well. where does that lead us, right? So we've got 10 years of open data, kind of reflections, taking stock of where we're at. I do invite you to go in on the Open Data for Development website. You're able to access all of these different articles and chapters that have been written by all these authors internationally. It's a really kind of valuable place to start, okay, if you're not so familiar with open data and you're interested in a particular issue area. But what are the possible scenarios for the future? Well, I'm not going to start kind of predicting what's going to happen, okay, but from where I'm standing with the networks that I'm seeing, well, the energy could shift to other trends. For example, I talked about algorithmic transparency and AI. You know, that's obviously one that we need to kind of understand better, but not necessarily at the expense of all the gains that we've made on the open data front. A new frame could tie many data-related topics together. So maybe it's a data governance frame that ties different issues of which open data could be a part of. Open data could be sustained as a field in and of itself. So maybe it's just going to continue in the way that it's going to continue, you know, and that's fine. Maybe there's energy for that. We might see more kind of sector-specific data efforts that will kind of maybe rise and dominate. Okay, that's one other scenario. A continued emphasis on openness within the data agenda is an interesting kind of shift as well. We didn't used to talk about kind of openness more broadly. We're focused much more on the kind of tangible technical aspects of kind of open data, but now we're talking more about kind of what is the mindset shift? What is the organizational change? What are these types of things where we need to actually kind of understand that openness as a concept can be quite threatening to people in organization. We're trying to shift the way that government works, not just government, but other kind of organizations and institutions. So that's, you know, that's a possible kind of scenario in unpacking openness. I've even seen some new businesses kind of emerge on openness management, right? And so you've got kind of business consultants that are now kind of using that language and talking about mitigating the risks of openness for organizations and companies. That arguably could be a derivative of the open government you know, sector or community. Data infrastructures need to be built for both open and closed data as well, right? Because we've been very, very focused on open data, but there's something to be said about shared data, something to be said about closed data itself as well. You can share closed data in a closed system. That wouldn't be my preference, but at the same time, I think we also need to realize that different types of investments might be appropriate for different types of needs for organizations and different sectors as well. Just looking at time here, how are we doing?
If you wrap up in the next 5 minutes, we'll have 20 minutes for questions.
Cool, okay, let's do that. Okay, that sounds good. So that's the kind of global context, right? Pretty tough to summarize a global context in 30, 40 minutes, but those are the kind of the main takeaways. So at the International Open Data Conference, like I mentioned, there was the Open Cities Summit, and the Open Cities Summit was a really good opportunity 2 years after the first Open Cities Summit to really kind of take stock of how the open cities conversation has had to reconcile itself with the smart cities agenda. Okay, and so and we were one of the co-organizers of that event, so you won't be surprised that we purposefully named the theme of the event on open smart cities. Okay, building on our definition and really kind of with a view of building a community of practice and a network of different organizations like Open North internationally to look at what is the role of cities in the open data movement, for example. And what we saw is that cities can sometimes be seen as paternalistic. Okay, so delivering services to and not with residents. Okay, so when you think of smart cities and you think of smart cities as responsive cities or networked cities, it's very important that we're able to kind of take those principles and apply them to accessing data and utilizing data in co-creation and collaboration and the civic engagement that's part of the open data set of principles. So it makes sense for cities to be very active in the open data movement due to shorter feedback loops between government and citizens. There's more potential to get citizens engaged in problem solving, for example. So not just as consumers or users of data, but really involve them in understanding what is the context of the problems that their experiences, their lived experiences at the micro level, community level, and borough or city level, and what's the data component to that. Cities have more opportunities to experiment with how to nurture civic engagement, not something that happens automatically. They can move faster, be more agile, try different things, and in the process help us think about what is the future of deliberative democracy as well. So it makes sense for openness and open data to insert itself into a smart city lens. There's a number of different things that we've seen around kind of improving public policy and services in cities from an open data perspective. The key kind of thing that I want to emphasize here, key point that I want to emphasize is the need to break down the simplistic kind of supply and demand or government and citizen kind of ways of thinking, right? I talked about a few times now, you know, the need to go past just publication, but publishing, you know, for whom and understanding the users themselves. There's a big push for that. Open data portals require a lot of maintenance and management, and therefore there's often pushback into the maintenance costs. I've seen a lot of different open data portals where you've got, you know, a city that makes a big kind of show, right? When they're launching an open data portal, and then there's no engagement strategy. There's no process to be able to kind of connect with the users, understand, okay, what data do they need? How do we prioritize inventories of data? Make sure that the right data assets are being connected to the right, you know, stakeholder communities. And then having government shift its approach at the city level, and I think smart cities are, you know, should be equipped for this, where they're leveraging their convening capacity and being shifting their role so that they're able to bring more value from the assets that they bring to the table in a complementary way, and not necessarily imposing themselves in local kind of multi-stakeholder dynamics that we're seeing in city context as well. And so that means that from an ecosystems approach to smart cities, there's a lot of different types of coalitions where many actors are invested, which means that these initiatives not just benefit from the knowledge of those actors, but that they can sustain political transitions as well. And that was a big topic that came up, you know, in the context at the event in Buenos Aires in Argentina on open smart cities, is that we always have to look kind of past our current circumstances as we're doing the work and build the kind of resilience within the gains from a transparency and accountability perspective, so that, you know, ideally we'd like to have open data laws as opposed to open data policies, for example. We want to entrench you know, more permanent deliberative mechanisms with stakeholders as opposed to one-off events, the things that I've mentioned earlier in terms of the shift of Open North's mission. And let me end there. I mean, I think those are some of the key kind of points that we heard in Argentina at the Open Cities Summit. And maybe I can take some questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jean-Noé. That you covered an awful lot of territory.
I did, yeah.
That's pretty impressive. Does anyone have a question to lead off?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that when you said the word trend, right, there is a very sweet spot how the terminology of this knowledge, right, gets really trendy and abused. And for example, open by default, right,
Yes.
being used in campaign, and yeah, so my question directly to Open North is, have you as an entity got a chance to view Bill C-51? And concerning it, have you been able to comment about it and offer suggestions?
So we haven't commented explicitly about it. So we haven't issued a public statement or an opinion piece about Bill 51. But I think to your kind of earlier point around open by default, I just want to touch on that. So you're right that open by default is it's almost a slogan, right? It's also a principle of the open data community, but it's an appealing slogan for elected leaders. But what it does, and we actually wrote a paper on that, on open by default, so that's why I'm picking that, kind of pivoting towards that. But there's a risk with open by default. It sets very, very high expectations because it's a kind of an absolute kind of principle. It's like open by default, it means automatically available, always, and whenever it meets a certain set of criteria, that data should be made available, by default. The challenge is that you have the political expectations that are convenient, there's probably not a lot of politicians who would argue against open by default, for example, right? And then it also sets the demand from civil society and other groups that data will be abiding, or the release process will be abiding by that principle. So the public servants that are in the middle are being squeezed between these two different sets of expectations. So we're now talking more of a transition towards publishing with purpose, which is kind of a new principle that may replace the open by default principle itself. But I think there's also other challenges related to publishing with purpose, because it kind of guides you towards having a case that you can justify why that data should be made available. And what I liked about open by default is that there's some data, regardless of whether or not somebody's going to go and download the data, or whether or not you're able to make the case that somebody will utilize the data, that it should still be made available by default. So it's less user-centric, whereas publishing with purpose, what it tries to incentivize and it creates a new problem by doing it, is that you're going to go to the context of users and kind of having a more targeted way of publishing that data. So there's a lot to kind of unpack between open by default and publishing with purpose. And the Government of Canada is a very big proponent of open by default. It has a few pilot programs at the national level on open by default, but it's all about scaling. If you can do a few pilots, that's good, but then how do you apply that on a broader range of data, across the public sector, and then apply kind of interoperability principles from a data standardization perspective, so that you're not just publishing a lot of data in terms of volumes. And that's partly why Canada is ranked #1 in open data indices, right? It's like, Canada's the best country on open data. Okay, really? We have to question that, because how is open data inserting itself into these communities of practice and stakeholder groups, right? So that we're not just talking about open data for publication's sake, but in how open data brings more value to problem framing and all that. So there's a shift that's ongoing right now.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. You mentioned relationships between data publishers and nonprofits and individual citizens, but I'm wondering if you can comment a bit on the use of open data by private corporations and the data governance issues that raises, in particular in smart cities, which is obviously a big hot topic now, given everything happening in Toronto.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, it really goes back to a governance issue, right? Like, who gets to decide what terms are established? We have very contrasting experiences between Toronto and Montreal in that regard, right? And we're probably kind of quite familiar with the kind of sidewalk lab kind of situation, right? Where you've got Alphabet, who then is given a mandate to be able to basically do city building in the center of Toronto. And Teresa is doing this work right now, right, with Sidewalk Labs, and maybe you're better actually positioned to kind of comment.
I'm not doing it with Sidewalk.
No. No, well, that's the thing, right? So it's because it's the legitimacy of the actors that are kind of involved in that process, and where we're now struggling, or we have a desire to come up with ways of kind of neutralizing those types of interests and incentives in ways that we can actually safeguard the interests of citizens and protect their identities. So that's a fine balance that you have to do right now. There's some literature now and some models that are being floated around creating data trusts, for example. That's the kind of research that Teresa and David at CIPIC and ourselves are kind of trying to unpack. But from a data governance perspective, I think when we're talking about the private sector, there's actually quite a lot that the private sector can contribute. I was on a call yesterday with the Aeroplan, right? So EMEA is a company that kind of runs the Aeroplan, and they came up to us and they said, well, we want to donate 200 analysts on food systems, and we're very, very interested in being able to find that data and develop prototypes and proofs of concepts and just kind of mash up data with local organizations. And you're like, okay, what are your motives? What interests you in that? Why are you doing that? you know, and is it your data? It's like, no, we want to find something interesting to do and kind of give back to kind of the Montreal ecosystem. So my tendency then is like, okay, well, who's working on food security or food systems? Who's curating that data? Because they're calling that kind of data philanthropy. They're calling that kind of, you know, sharing their expertise for the greater good. And I think we need to kind of recognize that the private sector is trying to kind of, you know, play a role in the openness, kind of not just the discourse, but the way that we're actually kind of benefiting in a complementary way, different types of skill set for, you know, designing better cities and better services and whatnot, right? And so what we did concretely with that corporation is that I connected them to the Urban Innovation Lab at the City of Montreal, and a number of different research networks that are, you know, driven by the sector itself that are already collecting data and being able to kind of share that in a public way, which they wanted to do anyways, but they don't have the capacity itself to kind of deal with that data. So, you know, the private sector, I think sometimes it's easy to kind of just pick on them and kind of go, all right, you know, your interests are, you know, maybe potentially in the wrong place, depending on your views, right? But let's remember that the private sector is going to be kind of innovating often much faster than we are, and they're going to seek those types of opportunities. And so most big corporations have open data products. It's just that they're in closed kind of corporate systems, right? But they do brand it as open data. Esri has that, Microsoft, IBM, like they all do, right? And we're seeing the same around kind of algorithmic transparency. It's like algorithmic transparency, but within their own systems themselves. So we have to be very, very vigilant, because at face value, you're like, oh, it's openness. But it's openness if you buy that, or if you buy into this, and then you get locked into these solutions over time. So from a smart cities perspective, that becomes a big challenge, is that, you know, what are the motives, what are the drivers, you know, what are the shared benefits in bringing in, you know, private sector organizations or private sector companies there. And it also depends on the type of kind of perception that you have for public-private partnerships, for example. And obviously Toronto is unpacking that in real time, and we're all kind of seeing, you know, what's happening there. And in Montreal, that would never have happened, because the government has a very, very different set of values and different set of attitudes towards public-private partnerships. It wouldn't have kind of created the enabling conditions for a sidewalk to have access to public land and do what it wants to do, or at least is attempting to do in the Toronto context. So that goes back to alternative kind of visions of what a smart city is. And just the last bit on that, it's like in Montreal now, we have politicians that are talking openly about, we want to be the alternative to sidewalk labs. So it's become actually a political positioning where you're like, well, we don't want to do that because of the uproar and all those issues. So for me, as an open data activist, I thank Sidewalk, because Sidewalk has been able to unearth and kind of, actually maybe not even unearth, but just kind of make some of these issues like much more visible, and kind of enabled us to have a very, very kind of vibrant and dynamic debate around issues that were already there, but now we have kind of a point of convergence to kind of say, okay, now we have a real kind of case study that's unfolding in front of us.
Thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to comment on your point, right? It's very interesting, some of the topics to review 51, C51, concerning the role of data openness in private and public relationships. For example, when there is some public investment mingled with a lot of private investment to give public services, where does data openness, right, enters? And so there's a lot of discussion on that, and yeah, sorry.
Well, the other point related to that is open contracting and procurement, right? Opening that up. And that's been a big kind of part of the Sidewalk Labs conversation as well. And like I said earlier, that's one of the most mobilized community internationally. So they're looking at Sidewalk as a case study of what not to do, right? But also as an opportunity to structure procurement in a much more open way. So, because that was the original kind of issue in my mind with Sidewalk, is that we never saw the original terms of that contract, right? And if you don't know, then, now we've been doing, different attempts at public consultation to kind of revisit the things that should have been kind of included originally. But if that would have been kind of out in the open earlier, maybe we would have mitigated some of the issues that have come up.
Other questions, comments? Jean-Noé, I have a general question.
Sure.
I think as Florian mentioned in the introduction, you're going to be here with us for the year as a Law Foundation of Ontario Fellow. What do you see the opportunities of being part of what we do here at the law school? What opportunities do you see for your work, for the work of Open North?
Yeah, quite a few. I mean, the first is to have more time to think, to be honest. So to, spend less time accumulating kind of air miles and just, having more time to read and to think and critically kind of name things that I'm seeing through, the networks that we're building and the stakeholders that we're working with, and then have a much more kind of systematic kind of research kind of approach to thinking critically around kind of the ethical issues, around how to situate citizens and their agency within a smart city context. I think there's probably a lot more barriers and obstacles that are visible or invisible to citizens in the way that they can influence the design of services and influence policies, and actually connect with one another in smart cities. And so I'm interested in what's the role of data in that? What is the role of technology and technological systems? As we're seeing a shift from open data towards algorithmic transparency, what does that mean? I think we're still struggling and trying to address some of the big challenges that we set out for the open data community. But at the local level, that's where we're seeing some of the kind of legal and ethical considerations around algorithmic transparency that, frankly, I think I need to spend more time kind of understanding. We know of a few kind of cases. The one in New York, for example, is one that's often cited, right? Where there was an initiative by the mayor of New York to release some algorithms around services that were managed by the city, and to release the part of the algorithms openly and let people do whatever analysis they wanted to do. And the open data community there pushed back and said, actually, don't release them because we don't have the context of where and who created those algorithms. And that's an interesting kind of counterintuitive kind of reaction by what you would think would have been very strong advocates to say, actually, yes, and do more of it. And so what it did is that the city of New York was then incentivized to create a multi-stakeholder working group. So again, going back to the governance of transparency and accountability, that's not just the corporate sector or lawyers, but also citizens and nonprofits and others, to be able to look at what are the rules and regulations around, the traceability of algorithms, understanding the impact of algorithms, setting standards of transparency and accountability around the creation of algorithms. So in my mind, that's kind of a shift that we're seeing in the openness space that I'm interested in exploring.
Looking forward.
Yeah, me too.
All right, if there are no further questions, then, you have one, go ahead.
A lot going on in my brain right now based on your discussion. Thank you. It seems like when you put in the context of the global and then open smart cities, it starts to get into a lot of conflicting themes and how to address those. And I feel like I'm not sure if we're even there yet. I think we almost, sorry to take a step back, but
Go for it.
It's almost coming back to that question of when, is it conducive or is it detrimental to a public-private interest? And if so, how do you test for that? What's the scope? Who assesses this?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. It's that systems lens now that we need to really kind of adopt. Whereas before it was more, I'm an open data activist and what I want is an open data policy. And then there's going to be an open data portal, and then there's going to be data on the open data portal, and then we'll organize events. We'll have a proof of concept of a new app. There will be more data because, allegedly if you have more good quality data, you can do this. But now it's all about these really messy kind of like relationships and power dynamics, and also the way that people are empowered to actually have more influence. So tracking that and understanding that kind of ecosystemic kind of view of cities as it relates to technological systems, as well as public administrations themselves, Like we've done work in Toronto where we've developed their open data strategy, their master plan for the city of Toronto on open data. And we just had to be realistic about what we could achieve, because there's 48 or 50 different kind of divisions or agencies within the city of Toronto, right? And so for us to understand all of the needs of all these different kind of stakeholders, that's quite challenging, right? If you want to have a comprehensive view. So we're seeing now, cities developing new ways of equipping themselves to be able to facilitate greater openness and accountability within the public sector itself. And so it's less about so open data teams now in cities are less about managing and collecting data themselves than having that kind of capacity building and culture shift kind of function within the public sector itself. And that's certainly the case in Montreal, where they've shifted away from a smart city office, which was more about building apps, to more of a urban innovation lab. That's drastically different. And I think that's reflective of a shift in kind of value systems, opportunities, the types of like cost benefits that, analysis that people are doing within public sector, so that we're actually breaking down silos within the public sector, and we're seeing open data as a common thread throughout, the bureaucracy. So that's, and each city is going to be slightly different or very, very different, depending on the size, regions, and budgets and whatnot. So that's also something I'm interested in, is to be able to kind of compare cities, and the smart city program that we're now, paid to, to administer with this one-to-one advisory service. It's going to put us in touch with, potentially upwards of 300 cities in the next 18 months in Canada. See, David, I named it. I told myself I wouldn't set these types of goals, right? Like 300 cities that people listen and they're like, oh man, how many cities have you connected with? But so the whole approach to that, it's a really, really tremendous opportunity to kind of get to that kind of, systems change kind of lens within cities, connecting these silos, and then also laterally connecting cities with one another. And so my brain just gets excited when I start thinking about what domains, what kind of regional, kind of clusters can we then shape around different problem areas to connect maybe a rural community, in Ontario to a rural community in BC, and another one there around different kind of problem areas. And how do we kind of multiply that, simultaneously, as we're also offering kind of a light touch advisory for different types of cities, or more in depth, So that's the planning that we're doing at the moment right now.
Well, thank you very much again, Jean-Noé. Again, I could say with all sincerity that we're just delighted to have you here for the year. I realize you won't be here in Ottawa the whole time, but to be able to work more closely with you on a lot of these issues will be a great opportunity for us and for students as well. So thank you very much for a really engaging talk, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.